Yeah, hello and welcome back. I have now the pleasure for the second part of our daily work to present Miranda Penel. Maybe we can show Miranda. She's in London at the moment and she will present her work. Miranda is an artist and a filmmaker based in London. She was originally trained in contemporary dance. And one of my favorites is one of your short films, Magnetic North, in 2003, of ice skating children doing ice skating and Finnish heavy metal bands. So it gives some dazzling cinematic effects about dancing on ice in the rhythm of heavy metal. So this is one of my favorites of your first and early films. But your more recent work uses photographic archives for a reflection of the colonial legacies. And you have done a PhD on the approaches, how to activate images from imperial archives. And I could mention the film Why Colonel Bunny Was Killed in 2010, which is about India and very actual Afghanistan, the northwest frontier, as the British call it. Colonial photos. The Host, which we will explore today a little bit in depth. It is about Iran and BP, British Petrol photos. And the film, which will be in your last session, the last film, Strange Object from 2020, it will be about aerial photographies. So what I find interesting in your work is that you're exploring the human and unhuman implications of the view that is fixed in the photos, and which no photo can hide. For me, it's a kind of unconscious moment which is included in these photos by official colonial British Petrol official archives, and that is one of your interesting research. To scrutinize it, to deconstruct these images, and now I'm quite curious to hear about the last works. So, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and hello, everybody. I've made a note to myself here to speak clearly. Please do intervene and let me know if I'm not coming through loud and clear in the room with you. So I'm really happy to be here. As Thomas said, I'm a filmmaker who's interested in finding ways of activating photographs to help us think about troubled or difficult histories and to try and engage different ways of relating to those histories. So in particular, my interest is in colonial legacies and working with photographs from colonial archives within the moving image. So I'm really happy to be doing this presentation at a photo museum which has an archive, so we can think about what an archive means. Maybe that's an implicit question while I'm talking and looking today. And I'm particularly fascinated by the idea that sequencing still images within the moving image has the potential to help us experience the relationship between the past, the present, the future in new and productive ways. So maybe getting out of habits and cliches of how we think about history and how we relate to it, and that maybe we can create some shocks or some disturbances which help us feel the presence of the past in the present. So as Thomas said, tomorrow I thought I'd talk a little bit about science fiction as a tool for doing just that, for making the past lively. And I was going to talk about voice, language, and present the short film Strange Object. Today I'm going to talk about mixing different kinds of photographs and the problems and opportunities that presents, in particular domestic family photographs on the one hand, at the same time working with official photographs from an archive in my case, from a corporate archive, and to think about what kind of possibilities are opened up by making this kind of mixing of categories, and what that asks us in terms of the relationship between personal memory and collective history. So I'm going to talk about this film, The Host. I think the pop-up team have will give you access to that film should you want, if you haven't seen it already, and if you would like to have a look at it afterwards. So I'm going to just set up a bit of context and just say a little bit about what it's about. It's a 60-minute film from 2015, and I wanted to explore the archive of BP, British Petroleum, and specifically the beginnings of that oil company in Iran when it was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company or Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. So I knew there was an enormous archive there of photographs as well as literature going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And I was interested, I thought this is an interesting archive to look at, because what I know about the history is that it's very much overshadowed by the coup d'etat that takes place in 1953. It's an Anglo-CIA collaboration that overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, and which caused an enormous trauma for Iranian people and had long-lasting effects and after effects throughout the 20th century. So on the one hand, I knew that there was that story there. I didn't particularly want to tell that story, but I thought, what happens when you go into the archive of the oil company? What do those photographs tell you, if anything, about what's happening in the background, these big geopolitical conspiracies that are happening? Can I see any of that? Can I see evidence of that when I look at photographs in the archive? And in particular, I knew that in the archive, apart from the official photographs, you also have many albums belonging to staff, people who worked for the company, who are British, who go to Iran for maybe 3 years or longer to work. A lot of their personal albums are in the archive. So I'm interested, I thought I was interested to see what those photographs would reveal. So this film, it's an essay film which weaves together several different themes and stories. And it also shifts between different time zones, because it starts in the late 20s and goes right through to the 70s. So I just thought I'd start by talking about these different, showing you some of the different image sources. So this is a big archive. Let me just pull up I'm going to share screen here. So this is the poster for the film. So there's a whole category of photographic materials in the archive, which I would put under the category of technical photographs. So the function of these images is to do with search, exploration, mapping, controlling territory, technical operations. So these are, and a lot of these are images that are taken from the air. You can see in these ones, you can see this image is from 1936. So that's one category. And equally, they're using the same photography to document their own technology, their own refinery in Iran. This is from Abadan in Iran. And I'm not sure if I can see a date on, 1947 perhaps, yeah. Then there's a whole category of images that come under the category of public relations, of self-presentation, of propaganda, if you like. And this corporation was very conscious about its image, producing an image. For me, this is a very particular kind of image, because this shows the center of power. These are the people who are controlling what happens, basically. And I also jump through time. So this is the equivalent image in the 70s. You can see the change in technology in terms of photography. It's much poorer, but you can also see the continuity in terms of the structure of the company. So there's lots of documenting of their own facilities. And then these are also PR, these are propaganda images which are demonstrating the housing in Iran, where they've obviously got local, presumably Iranians, to stand in and to dress up in the photograph. It's interesting that there's a man there wearing a chef's uniform, as though an Iranian family would have a butler or a chef, which is extremely unlikely. Same thing here, housing, advertising their housing, advertising their technology, and in particular hospital technology, Western British technology being brought to Iran. Then the other shift then is these personal albums. So this is a huge shift and gives a very different perspective. And I think of it, it's like a perspective from the ground. So this would be one person's album that I found in the archive from 1927. This album was, I use quite a lot of this particular individual's images as he goes to work, as he travels around in Iran. And this is another of his photographs when he's in a market. And this is one of my parents' photographs. So I haven't mentioned yet that my parents' photographs are part of my personal heritage. They're not part of the official archive, but I had these images at home. So these are pictures. I think that's my much older brother and sister on the far left of the picture. And this is a picture of my mother with a car, presumably taken by my father. The final category of images that are in this film are images that I've taken while I'm making the film of myself in the archive. So, and this is another image. This image is part of of me while I'm making the film. Close that down. So before I play a clip from the film, I suppose I just should flag up some of the questions or problems that I have when I'm thinking about how to use these materials. This is a vast archive, all different kinds of materials, all mixed up together. And obviously the central question always is, how can I use, by the way, I'm using the term colonial. Iran was not an official colony, but in every other way, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, Britain is controlling everything economically and in terms of power. So how am I going to use what I would think of as the colonizers' photographs? I think of them as testimonies. I have to make a film using the colonizers' testimony. So images that have been taken under situations of radical inequality. How do I do that without simply reproducing the violence and the erasures of colonial ways of looking? How do I not just repeat that way of looking at the world while using these materials? And given that a lot of people, the stories that I'm looking for and the people that I'm looking for, or the oil workers, are not documented, their images are not in the archive, how can I make other stories visible within this story? And then in terms of what I'm going to talk about now, which is about my family's involvement, how can I use my parents' photographs without recreating a colonial hierarchy of visibility, by the danger of making my parents into central actors in this drama, And we know that biographical or autobiographical stories have a very strong appeal and identification for an audience, and that effect would displace the colonized and exploited subjects, which I would like my film to give space for. So those are the kind of worries that I had throughout in thinking about how I would approach the film. So I think I'm going to ask Ranav to show the first clip, which is a very short clip. It's just 3 minutes. It's in a way, it's quite hard to show little bits of this film because it's got many different kinds of images and from different sources. But this is a very short clip which combines all of the several different sources in one clip. So I think it's a good one to start to give a feel for the film. It has a voiceover, which is my voiceover, and this is about 30 minutes into the film. And if I could ask Ranav to play it with quite high volume, because I think the overall level is quite low. Thank you.
I'm finding it hard to concentrate this afternoon. My attention is divided. All of a sudden, these tiny men regroup and look straight through the lens at me. I want to get them back into their box, but they're holding me against my will. When I eventually get out of the building, I feel completely drained. I've been staring out of the train window for 20 minutes before the ticket inspector informs me that I am headed in the wrong direction. I spend the next morning in bed, reading about 1951.
As flood relief efforts continue in Oxfordshire, Surrey, Somerset and along the Thames. They also announced that 600 troops have been deployed in flood-hit areas. The troops will be invaluable, having spent the last 10 years
In the evening, I dig out a box of my father's slides.
People in Surrey have no...
It has my name written on it. I inspect the slides for clues, but decide to discount them because they don't show anything significant.
Okay. So in this clip, I explicitly I tell the viewer that I've decided not to show any of my family's photographs because I don't think they're important, which is an accurate reflection of where I was at a certain point in making the film. As it turns out, the last 15 minutes of the film are only my family's photographs, and I'll show a clip of those in a minute. I suppose, so that clip shows me moving between these different materials and moving between different time zones, which the photographs, the images represent. I suppose I'd just say something about the first person. This wasn't always going to be a first person film. That's something that happened during the making when at the point at which I decided to include my family's photographs, I then realized I had to speak and I had to be in the film myself. I think going by this clip, I think you can see that the film becomes, with my voice in it, I realized that the film becomes a kind of dramatization of the process of researching and searching through the images, and that it gave me the opportunity to actually restage and re-perform the experience of looking at images in an archive, the process of looking at an image and searching for meaning, and me being able to, and I'm trying to recreate that for the viewer, both through framing, by sequencing, by adding sound, and by commenting on the images. And it also means that I can acknowledge how subjectively these images, which are evidence on the one hand, proof of something, of things happening, but it enables me to acknowledge how subjectively they affect me and affect maybe all of us. And in that clip, I think I sort of suggests that a photograph has the power to haunt me as an onlooker, and that maybe I'm also haunted by the past. So I think this thing became quite important to me, the idea of looking being a process. And it's both a social process where you're picking up bits of information from every photograph and putting it together, but it's also a psychic, unconscious process which is acting on the emotions all the time. And I wanted to show how the image has power over me as well as me. It's not only me controlling what the image says. And I think that made me think as well ask a question about what constitutes historical knowledge, how is it made, and trying to draw attention to the process of meaning making as a process that's very subjectively rooted in whoever the historian is or whoever the person telling the story is. That it's a kind of provisional and uncertain process. So as I said in the beginning, it was only when just to say a little bit about the process of making, I first of all put all of these different sequences of images together, photographs with no voice on them, into a sort of logic that went through time, that moved across time. But I didn't know how to speak to these images until I thought the last section, I've got to look at my parents' photographs, even though I don't think they're interesting. They don't say anything about labor in Iran, about the oil company. They're more like tourism photographs. Why would I include them? Then when I laid them out, I thought, okay, well, now I have to say something, I have to speak. I sort of have a duty to contextualize these images. So I started writing and then I recorded my voice. And at that point, I realized I could now go back to the beginning of the film with this voice, with myself. I thought, I'm now in the film, whether I like it or not, I'm implicated in this whole story. So now I can speak. So perhaps I should go ahead and show that clip from the family snapshots. I have to say that I don't normally show the family snapshots section of the film on their own, because it comes at the end of the film and the whole context is everything else that's happened, which isn't to do with my family. So I have a reservations about presenting it for the reasons that I indicated earlier, which is my film is not about me or about my families, but it's about what happened. But let's have a look at clip number 2, if that's all right, Ranaf. This is about 5 minutes.
It's June 1963 in Fields. I have now been born. Today is Black Friday and afternoon light is pouring into the generous open-plan living space which we will soon be moving into in northern Tehran. The mountains rise majestically behind the modernist architecture as the army opens fire on demonstrators across several cities. In 3 years' time, I'll be outside, floating in a pool of blue water, squinting into the sunlight. My father takes the photographs. He has no special aptitude for pictorial composition. He first came to Masjid-i Suleiman as an engineer in 1946. After the coup d'etat, he is assigned a role in the International Oil Consortium. Now he is returned to Iran as deputy field manager, and later will leave Fields for Tehran. Mountains. Frogs. Locusts. Vietnam War. The camera is at some distance from two groups of figures, each clustered around a large puddle of spring water. Rivulets of water run here and there are patches of green on the stony ground. I can make out a woman ladling water into a big black receptacle. There's a wide copper bowl with smaller cooking items in it, and an old woman in a red skirt walks up the slope on the right, carrying a heavy container at her hip. My father takes the photograph, while my mother, sister, and her friend from boarding school are getting out of the car. Now they are in the muddy clearing. They can hear the sides of a copper pot being rubbed by a sandy palm. The owner of the sandy palm turns her head to look at the English woman, who wears a pale pink cotton shirt, sunglasses, and a grey-blue scarf over her hair. She is flanked by two younger women, positioned like backing singers, who also wear pale cotton shirts, sunglasses, and scarves folded and worn as headbands. Both stand staring at this picture, as though they're not meant to be part of it. Two events are taking place in this village: a wedding and the visit of a stranger. My father will record both events, first from his elevated position and later from ground level. My father will photograph the scarves. The villagers hold them like flags between forefinger and middle finger, creating a variety of patterns. My father won't see the meaning behind this semaphore. He'll not decode the message the village has for him. but he'll photograph it because of its striking, colourful character. The writing at the bottom of the slide reads, "Wedding in Sultan's village." I email my sister, who informs me that Sultan is the driver of our two-tone Chevrolet. She writes that he has striking blue-green eyes. It's hard to tell from here.
Okay. So, despite my reticence at putting myself into the story, I realized as soon as I did that to speak in the first person is actually a point of power as a narrator, and that it's a very useful device. Fundamentally, I mean, I become a human link to the story that I'm narrating. And my presence brings a distant place, Iran, a distant time. Well, those images are from the early 60s. They make it, I'm the link to those things, and therefore I make them present. And one of the challenges for talking about the colonial and maybe talking about all histories is to recognize the continuities and the closeness, that the past is never finished, it's always with us in so many ways, and that it lives through people who have memories. So that's including me, including many Iranian people, where this history is still affecting people. So very directly being there, that gives does something to the story I'm telling, makes it less abstract. And then I realized, well, I'm now not an observer. I'm looking at all these pictures. I'm not only an observer, I'm actually an actor in this history. I have a place in it. I have a place in it. I'm active. My family were active in it. And that means that also in terms of in my role as a historian, it's a kind of history that I'm doing, so I'm going to call myself a historian. But the things that historians do traditionally has been to erase their presence within the stories they narrate, to erase the time from which and the position from which they're writing is never visible. And so this is a different kind of history when you make those things visible, when you declare the place and the position from which you're writing or speaking. That gives a different kind of transparency and different kinds of story, because you know that I have a stake in this story, that there is I have an investment in it, and I'm declaring that, and then that brings this whole question of a personal memory and a collective history that I'm dealing with at first secretly, and then once I'm in the film, it's a little bit more public. Then there's a question of responsibility, of what kind of responsibility do we have, both as individuals and collectively, for things that have happened in the past, for regimes that were really quite brutal and exploitative, and how do we relate to those? So those are the kind of questions that I was able to think about once I'd realized that this was a story that I was in addition to being able to speak about the photographs from a more subjective point of view, as I was talking about earlier, and what they do, how they act on us, and the very many different ways of talking about an image. I'm just wondering if there's something else on that I could talk about. I could maybe, I should probably open it up to questions and comments from the audience in a minute. Perhaps I could just pick out a couple of things from the clip that we've just seen. For people watching online, the sound is a little bit odd. I could hear the voices, but none of the small sounds underneath. But I guess the voice is the most important thing there. I could just say something about my approach to these pictures. Is that on the one hand, I thought they looked but I should say that both my parents are no longer alive. That I went to look at these photographs after my mother had died. And I hadn't seen them before, and they looked very strange to me. So it's not that I'm familiar with the things in them, even though I recognize the people in them are family members. I thought it was interesting that in a way I looked at them in this, like I felt as though I'm an anthropologist looking at people in a picture and I'm trying to work out what they're doing and why they're doing it. I sort of feel the same way about my parents, which is also one of the questions in the film which is, I love my parents. Why are they participating in this very unjust project of exploitation? But equally, I'm thinking, so there's a picture that's I find very striking of the tribal people in a forest who are doing their washing up in a puddle or in a stream, a spring that's in the ground. And my mother's watching and my sister's there. And it's as though she's showing my sister what they're doing. And, I just tried to think a little bit about language and what I wanted to draw attention to, the viewer's attention to. And rather than talking about the fact that the tribal people are using these fantastic goat skin containers for collecting water, I thought instead of drawing attention to the exotic strangeness, that I wanted to talk about the exotic strangeness of my family, the strange way they're dressed, which looks very American, and the strange way they look at each other. There's this exchange of looks in the photograph. So I guess that was I'm trying to find ways to talk about the photographs, to not exoticize the other, and maybe to ask questions about the people who have the power in the photograph, which is my family. I think I'm sort of tempted to open that up rather than you've heard my voice in the film and my voice over the internet. I'd love to hear somebody else's voice maybe, or to hear a response or answer any questions.
Okay, so ja. Gustav, kommst du auch? Ja, wir befragen jetzt zu dritt. Okay, thank you, Miranda. There are many questions. First of all, maybe I should remind the people that you can register on the internet at the site of the Photo Museum Berlin, and then you had access to the whole film because you could only show these 2 short clips. You can see the whole film, and also you get other links of the films of Katja, Gustav, and Sarah. So it is only until Sunday. No? So if you write today, you will probably get tomorrow the access. So that's just some information. Okay, maybe we start with the archive. No? You presented photos from a corporate archive. These are not collective images. These are representational photos. And what is the difference to the personal archive, in your opinion? No, the personal archive, maybe the picnic in Iran, or you showed that your father has photographed sometimes like a tourist, no, who is flowers, who's showing flowers, and village event, a dance where they wave with these towels, and so. But on the other hand, you process or you work with these images as if they were taken by a stranger. Maybe you analyze, you say he's photographing from an elevated position. So in a way you try to do, to scrutinize it with the same aspects as you scrutinize the images of British Petrol. Or are there differences? So maybe we can try to get this a little bit clearer.
Yes, I think that the first thing is, at first I thought they were not interesting images because they're mainly tourism images. And for some reason, I could never find, any images of modernity, Iranian modernity, for example. And what my parents seemed very interested in was tribal things, ancient history. These are all the things in their photographs. And in a way, this is a kind of primitivism and an Orientalism in the way of looking, which I think is interesting. I mean, my mother had genuine interests in weaving techniques, the crafts, these things. But I also realized that it's a form of nostalgia of Europeans are looking for something which is lost, which they can find in another culture. And on the one hand, it's a kind of fetishization of the so-called primitive, which they're documenting and often lamenting that these things are disappearing, or and at the same time, they are the cause of the disappearance of the things. But when I looked in the archive, the official archive, as I mentioned before, it contains both propaganda images, PR images, technical images, but also a lot of staff members' private albums. And I realized that the staff, the people who work for the company who are English, take exactly the same photographs as my parents, the same type of photographs. Even if it's in 1930, in 1940, in 1950, in 1960, they're going to the villages and photographing people weaving on a loom, or it's the same fascination. So I think those images do tell us something. And why don't they photograph the evidence of modernity or the city where they live? That's much harder to grasp. So I think it's interesting that my parents' photographs are just like all the others, although they have an emotional meaning to me. But I recognize that my family is like all those other families who were sent to Iran to do this job. So I found that interesting in itself. There were a few photographs which I found very emotional, and I didn't put them in. I didn't include the ones which evoked something for me about my parents who are no longer alive. So there was a few in there that made me stop and, take a moment. But the rest of them, I did feel like an anthropologist making a study. It's just that I know these people, and I was able to remember things that my parents said about Iran and said about the people they knew. And I was able to write to my sister and say, who is that man, or who is this person? It's written on the slide, this name. And my sister, who's 17 years older than me, has actual memories, so she could fill in. So I guess I have some privileged information which can bring these pictures to life in a way that's a little bit different from the official archive.
Yeah, thank you. So are there any questions from the public? And we have to look at the internet, of course.
Yeah.
No? And Yeah, okay. Yeah.
You're going to say the question, we're going to repeat this for the live stream, yeah?
Yeah, it's about, the question was about that you are calling yourself an anthropologist. You're looking like an anthropologist on the images, on the photography, and about the father, your father, the difference of your father, and maybe you can repeat the last. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So the question was if your father was more acting like a tourist and who couldn't decode everything, and you could decode it nowadays. Yeah, and the awareness of yourself as who has the power to decode, no, in this process. And maybe, yeah, maybe you have some examples you can tell us that if they have specific decisions taken where you were aware to your power that you have as a no, someone decoding it a little bit
Yes.
later.
Yes. On the one hand, I was quite interested when I talk about my father framing the pictures. On the one hand, I thought it was a good metaphor for his role in Iran because he has the power to frame things in his job. He has a managerial position in the oil company. So I thought maybe that was a way of talking about his role, he's the one who has his hands on the technology, who frames things at the time. It's true that I try to suggest, because I'm always asking myself, why can't they see what's happening? Or if they can see it, why can't they see their complicity in something that's very unjust is a question that I have. So there is a theme. I mean, I think the whole thing of decoding is really interesting. And it's actually one of the themes in the film, because I follow the story of one of the friends of my parents, who is an amateur archaeologist who is trying to decode ancient remains in Iran while he's exploring for oil, and he's doing it wrongly as well. He gets it very wrong, but it becomes a metaphor for the colonial project, an imperial project. It's a kind of fantasy. So I'm interested in the idea of decoding because that's exactly what I feel like I'm doing. I'm looking at these images and I'm thinking, what the hell do they mean? What does it mean? How can I make meaning out of these snapshots of tourism? And what does it actually tell us? What do any of these images tell us about what happened or what people experienced? And so I hope that I make visible my power. I mean, I think one of the things I do quite a lot is I make mistakes, which I hope are visible mistakes, or I speculate about pictures, saying things which can't actually be true, but which are just thoughts. Because I think that's what happens when I can look at the same picture. Sometimes I go back to the same picture and I see different things when I go back. I can realize some detail that I haven't actually recognized when I go back to it. So I'm just I try to make that process visible of looking, of re-looking, of noticing, of not noticing. And of course, there's no way that my father could. Well, I think the people in the village were definitely giving him a signal of something because they look so angry. He's there dominating this wedding because they're all standing on a roof. There's a wedding going on, but everyone in the wedding is just looking at these people, and they don't all look that welcoming and happy about these people. So I'm wondering whether he noticed when you looked at the pictures. Because I personally wouldn't feel comfortable doing that, but I guess I'm inviting everyone to try and decode these pictures and try and think about what it means. I don't know if I answered the question in a way.
Yeah, and maybe we can. You already given some examples that we can, in this kind of way. You are presenting this first-person singular film. We take part in the process of meaning making. You already said this, and it is there's a certain transparency. So this is, if we talk about the power of the filmmaker, of course, there is a power, but I think these should be repeated, these two aspects. Okay.
Maybe just one question, Miranda, is did you ever ask your parents about this? About the thoughts or notion that you just developed for the pictures?
Sorry, did I talk to my parents
if you ever asked your parents about about their perception of colonial past?
You know, it's different after your parents have died, and also I think when you grow up, you try to distance yourself, or I did, from their world. And then later on, I'm more interested in actually looking at it more closely and recognizing that this is where I come from, and that I think that's quite important. I did. I mean, my mother, after my father died, my mother read a book about the overthrow of Mossadegh. And she was really shocked, and she said, "You've got to read this." She tended to blame the Americans, was one way of, and they tended to say that the Shah of Iran was very corrupt. I remember them saying that, but no one was more corrupt than the British, and they put him there so that he could be their corrupt puppet. So my mother was critical. My mother's very interested in other cultures. She's interested in, she was somebody who was interested in other people. And actually she had a sort of anti-colonial, she thought colonialism was terrible, but I think she didn't quite recognize it. She didn't or wasn't able to recognize, maybe when she was older, I think she could. So, yes. I mean, I think what was important for me was I had questions about how I relate to my parents in this. And I think it was important that I put this as a question for myself and for all of us to think about being complicit or not noticing, not taking the trouble to notice the structures that we are complicit in, as a question for all of us. That's not about, I'm critical of the system that my parents were part of, and I'm critical of them for not being more observant, but I hope that the film raises it as a question for everybody.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Maybe I give you the mic because your questions are very long.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned on the introduction, it mentioned about kind of human and non-human applications, and I wondered a bit whether you've reflected on this work and the element of it being about the extractive industries in a contemporary setting and looking at kind of global climate politics, perhaps there's anything from this work that speaks to you on that aspect.
But for a moment, I was waiting for the microphone to come to me. And then it's just a weird illusion that happened. Anyway, yes, I mean, it wasn't my main focus, but I mean, when I went into the archive not knowing what I was going to find, and I'm looking at images, and initially I want to look at, I'm trying to find out what happens, and it's very hard to find the images you want to find. I'm looking for evidence of something, but I don't know which album to ask for. I don't know how. It's an enormous archive. I'm swimming in a sea of what feels like often searching a photographic archive can be very random depending on how it's indexed, how much detail there is, because generally it's done by place, by person, by date. But actually I want to look up things like, landscape, labor, just oil, the presence of oil. Are there any, and it's not, so I'm looking at all of these, this vast sea of images, trying to make sense of them. And in the end, the sense that I could make was really understanding that these images are not showing me what happened. They're showing me how people look, how people see, and how the company sees. So it's about a way of looking. And that way of looking is an objectifying way of looking at land, at minerals, at rocks, at humans, in order to exploit them. So I think that is bound up into it, this constant measuring and so I think that's all I'd probably say about that. It's definitely and it's an interesting archive to look at. Also, the Moving Image Archive. I did go and look at all of the old commercials and propaganda films that they made right through the whole of the 20th century. And it's quite amazing because they use oil, for instance, they use it as a metaphor of blood that keeps society going as arteries, and that if you stop the oil, we'll all die. And it's sort of quite astounding the way imagery about oil, how it was promoted is extraordinary, and it was a massive scheme to persuade everyone that this is how the planet will live because of oil and petrol. And so it's really, I mean, anyone can go and look at, well, I think almost anyone, you can get access to look at those commercials going right through. And I did do a screening where I presented some of these, and from that point of view, it's really instructive to understand the mentality that we were given and that we took on as a society.
Any questions? So maybe I can give another comment, which I find very interesting in your work, is that to me, the photos in the archive, in the corporate archive, they are prisoners. And in a way, you liberate them, that they become a witness in a historical process, or we can even tell it, name it a historical trial. That is quite interesting process, because if no one is looking at these images, or only the company, I don't know if they still use it. Probably it's just the archive, and I imagine that very rarely people come and look at them, at these images. So maybe you can a little bit describe how you find these images, how you work, what you discovered from the beginning and until the end, where you produced the film. Because these describe a little bit this process of liberation. of the images.
That's a nice way of putting it. I mean, first of all, I thought I was a prisoner in the archive. After a little while, I was so confused and exhausted because it's very chaotic. It's not very well managed. The photographs are not very well handled or preserved. They don't have many staff, strangely. It's a private archive at the University of Warwick. And I became, this problem of being able to find the images you want to find, you really need to browse. You want someone to let you just have a look around. And instead, you have to say place, date. You know, I just put in a load of it felt really, really random, basically. I just wanted a great big album that would have enough pictures that there would be something of use in it. So, and of course, what the normal usage is somebody will go in saying, I want to illustrate, you know, the coup, or I want to illustrate the first time oil was found, and they'll find, so that's the same, like the same 100 images get used a lot for the same key moments, because that's how historians tend to work with images. It's a challenge though, because when you've seen your 100th oil drill image, I'm thinking, what on earth does it, you know, the search for meaning at times gets quite overwhelming, and the lack of meaning. Also, there are certain narratives that I find it hard to escape from, and that you have to work out. Like, I couldn't understand why the oil pipelines were so small going over the mountain. They kind of look almost, and then it took me a long time to realize that the pipelines are mainly about, it's mainly the game is to keep the oil in the ground in order to keep the price up and to release it in small quantities to keep the price right. And what you're also doing is they're conquering territory, they're owning territory to stop anyone else's pipelines from crossing. So as I was looking at images, I was trying to also understand why things look they are, and to kind of learn things from looking. But it's full of, you know, when at the time, I went and looked a lot, and then I went home, I scanned lots of images, I went home, and then I thought, oh, in 6 months, when I've worked out what I really need to look for, I'll go back and then I'll make the film, and I'll do a search which isn't random. But actually, I came home with hundreds of images, and I just thought I can never go back and start this process again. And I've got to, within what I've got, even though it feels very random, I'm going to find the story that's in these images, and that's what I did. And I think the most important thing for me was understanding that it's about looking at ways of looking more than capturing events. I don't know if that really answered.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this choice of word liberating, because actually these pictures are pictures from a corporation. And I think liberating for me would mean that these are pictures that, I don't know, that maybe come from a different point of view, you know, from the other side, but actually these are images you need to comment. Yeah, you know, you cannot just leave them alone. We know this also with other pictures. Gustav and I were just working right now on images from the concentration camps, you know, and there's also this question, you know, so who did the pictures? And very often now also in exhibitions, these are the only pictures they have to show, but the problem is that a lot of people don't read them as pictures of the people who had a lot of control, you know, so...
Yeah. You're completely right.
I wanted to ask Miranda, so this work in this archive, you know, is there a kind of communication between the archive and you? Are they interested in your work to show this also? Do they know how you use the images of their archive?
I was just going to mention one thing quickly, which is some activists on campus have wanted to close down the archive because of BP's implication in destruction and climate change. And obviously, I'm all for the activism, but I think we should use I think the archive has some important things that we can use. Therefore, I think archives are important and are available for anyone to use. Having said that, I know that I believe that BP only allows up to a certain year, maybe in the 70s. After that, it's kind of confidential. So there are some politics around this particular archive. But I would say that I was given a lot of access and they weren't that interested in what I was doing. I mean, I gave them, you know, like with most archives, you give an indication of what you're doing. I think one thing that was interesting was that after the film was finished, I was asked whether BP in Iran might be because BP is now back in Iran. I don't quite know the details of it, and that they might be interested to show the film. And I was like, the British Council asked me this, and I was horrified that the oil company now could use a critical film, presumably to promote itself. I don't know, as a self-critical company, I really don't know. So that was interesting. But I mean, my engagement with the archive, because I needed so many images, they told me they couldn't scan all the images I wanted, but they accepted my proposal that I would scan them myself. And that way they could benefit from having more images digitized, and I would benefit from doing it. And this completely transformed my relationship to the film, because I became physically active in the process of picking up albums, opening them, turning the pictures over. I could scan them how I wanted. I could scan the box, I could scan the back. That was really wonderful, and that made me more interested in this idea of actively putting myself in the film, and me being a historian who's physically present in an archive, intervening in history in some way. So I think that was quite important to me as part of the process.
Yeah.
Any last question or comment?
Yeah, maybe I can say it more correctly than I have quickly done it. In fact, you're doing a subversive act. You turn the images over, like we turn over a glove or a secret agent who changes sides. That's my impression of your work. That's a kind of subversive use of this archive material, of course. And sometimes these companies they like to show that they are very liberal and they allow it. But the important act is that we can think about history, about the past. Even these companies, they are not obliged to stick to the rules of the 50s and to stick to the company ideas of the 50s. In my opinion, they can be more open and they can say, okay, nowadays is a different time and we can allow access to the materials because we have the opportunity to think about a historic process, about this troubled past.
Yeah, I have a last question because you didn't show this, the film, The Host is a long film, but you have also very interesting use of text, and I think it's even a doubling because you also use in another part of the film text which comes from the time. There's also a book which goes through the film. Could you, and we saw the book also, and you unterstreichen, you underline some of the words. So could you tell something about the book and the text, how text works in your film?
I mean, there's several different kinds of text. I really wanted to work with images and sounds, and the poetics of the images is quite important to me, and getting the images to do as much as they can. But I know, like anyone, I have to use some contextual information I have to give to the audience. So in the short clip there, I've got text on that I showed earlier. I give some text about that they're going to overthrow Mossadegh. The British are going to ask Mossadegh to overthrow. So that happens, I think, 3 times in the film. I give some just concrete information that gives a bit of context, and I try to make that as compressed as possible. It's just like the minimum that you need to know of historical facts, which then liberates me to then present images and let the viewer's imagination, I hope, think about the images in a free way without having to explain context all the time. Are you talking about the book of the explorer, the geologist who is interested in archaeology?
Yeah, because I think it's kind of doubling, like the imagery of the archive and this kind of text. You know, can you tell something about the book?
Yes. So when I start looking for information about Iran, I find a book. Well, when my mother dies, as well as these photographs, there's a book that I find, which is a kind of self-published book. It's the memoirs of a geologist. Oh my God, the name has gone out of my mind. But it's the adventures of a young geologist in Iran, and it has a picture of an ancient ziggurat on the cover, and it's all the letters of this geologist when he goes out in the 1930s. And the book is signed to my mother from the man's wife after he's died. So I go and see the wife, and then she tells me about how they're very interested in these archaeological theories, which are quite about a group of, about how the basically this man taught himself to read cuneiform script from the ancient tablets, and from this he draws out a theory about the origins of humankind coming from who came from outer space basically and land on the earth like colonizers, and they're very intelligent and they're full of advanced technologies, and they teach human beings how to be civilized. So it just feels like he's describing the imperial project. And so I sort of thought, okay, I'm going to follow this mad story because it perfectly describes the imperial relationship. But the other thing it does is it articulates a fascination, the Orientalist fascination with ancient history, particularly in the Middle East, where, and this is throughout the BP archive, you can see evidence of this. It's the story we tell about ancient civilization that has been dormant, that was a great civilization and in the modern era is dormant or even backwards, and that we as Europeans will go and liberate the people, whether it's in Iran or Iraq or whether. And I share a fascination with archaeology and with the exotic and with the ancient. But what's so fascinating is the denial of the contemporary and of the recent past and of the present exploitation. So it's kind of like a cover. And so the BP, the company, makes all these commercials about ancient Persia, and it's something that it's just very deeply rooted in our culture, and it's been used by imperialism while you're exploiting and extracting and destroying the present. You talk about the great ancient culture. So anyway, that's a strong theme throughout, and I used this book, this publication, and his letters. And his research as a metaphor, as a faster way, as quite a fast way of creating an image of how power works, because it's a that's the big challenge of the film. How can I I can't literally explain all the things that the British did, all of the corruption, all of the exploitation, all of the cheating they did. But by telling this story, by telling this allegory, this allegorical story of people who come from outer space, it kind of somehow crystallized a narrative about power. That was rather a long answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. But a great command, last command maybe. So because we met us tomorrow again with the newest project and
Strange objects.
yeah.
And
so
session 2.
thank you, Miranda. It was quite interesting, and hopefully we will met tomorrow at the same place, 3 o'clock.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
It was a
thank
pleasure.
you. See you tomorrow, 3 o'clock.
Bye.
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 Thanks.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, danke.
Thank you, and we all see us tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Until then, bye.